All right, so this is Mei, and we'll just get the interview started. And so first, Mei, can you just tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, thank you, Ben. My name's Mei-Li Thompson. I'm half American, I'm half Chinese, but I grew up in Singapore my whole life. I went to Penn for undergrad, studied history and economics, and then have been in consulting at Kearney out of their New York office for the last 4 years, and now have just started at Wharton and the Lauder Program with Ben a couple weeks ago.
Awesome. And you went to Penn already for undergrad, and now you're going to Wharton for your MBA.
Yep.
And so I was curious, why did you decide to go, undergrad here and also your MBA here instead of maybe anywhere else?
Mm-hmm. I think for undergrad here, my grandfather actually went to Penn, so it just seemed like I visited, I love the campus, I'd never lived in America, and I liked Philadelphia as a city when I was walking around. And Penn's obviously a great school, so it was a pretty easy choice to apply here, early decision for undergrad. Coming back for grad school was a bit of a question. I think Penn overall was a pretty great school undergrad, but there were definitely ups and downs for me. But coming back for graduate school, I think 1, the Wharton program is great. 2, I got in here. And 3, the Lauder program is a very unique and special program. And I think that really drew me to Penn and wanting to come back for graduate school here.
Got it. And yeah, we'll go into the whole Lauder program a little bit later and your thoughts on it. But I did notice you mentioned you had some ups and downs in undergrad. How would you kind of characterize those experiences?
I think for what schools typically don't tell you when you go in for undergraduate is how kind of what they prepare you for. I think, it's not many people know when they come to Penn how pre-professional it is. I think since you have the Wharton undergraduate influence, it kind of permeates campus. And so while on the plus side, there's so many great opportunities and career counseling, and everyone above you knows exactly what it's like to go into consulting or finance, and people really equip you well for that. It also just kind of has this edge of competitiveness and stress and needing to get either a good job in finance or consulting. So I think it can be kind of tough to manage, especially if you didn't have the expectation coming in. Because I think I came in, had never heard of consulting, and then suddenly it's like the only thing that I'm recruiting for and working really hard to get a job in. So I think schools in general don't do a great job of kind of letting you know, they just basically tell you if you want to come in, you do liberal arts, you can do whatever you want, study whatever you want. But I think the reality, especially if you want to go into finance or consulting or corporate jobs like that, schools aren't always super transparent with you before you come, how you can best prepare yourself for that. So I think that kind of was what I didn't expect when I came to Penn.
Got it. And so you weren't sure, it sounds like you were not sure necessarily what you wanted to do with your career, but then you ended up in consulting. Why did you end up in consulting then?
Well, a lot of people at Penn undergraduate, you either end up going into finance or consulting. And I knew I didn't want to do finance, so I chose consulting.
Okay.
And I also, on a more seriously, really like the idea of, even the whole marketing spiel they give you, for the most part, it is pretty true. Like various clients, different types of projects, working with new people all the time, meeting new people. Something that was a little more broad. And I think that's what I was looking for, with the thinking that I wanted to keep my options open.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that a lot of times people, maybe on the outside, criticize consultants for is that, you're kind of just out of college, and at least for the junior consultants, you're just out of college, and now you're kind of telling these CEOs, CFOs, or VPs kind of how to run their business in a sense. That's kind of what it looks like on the outset. And so obviously you have more senior consultants who have a lot of expertise and et cetera, but there's this kind of criticism sometimes that consultants, it's questionable what kind of value they actually bring to their clients. And so what do you feel like the value is that consultants bring to any of the projects they work on?
Well, I think to answer your question from kind of 2 parts. 1, because you mentioned more junior consultants, and I would like to think I brought some value as a junior consultant. But what I think most people forget is even just, for want of a better phrase, like the blood, sweat, and tears you put in as a junior consultant. Like, I think for a lot of times, like very bureaucratic, big Fortune 500 companies that you work for, like they are quite slow moving. It is quite hard for them to get something done because they do have all these other responsibilities in their day to day. And it's always difficult for clients to find resources who can fully dedicate themselves to whatever projects we're working on as consultants. So for me, even as a junior consultant, as an analyst, like staying up all night to build someone a model in a day would normally take a client weeks to do. And so that's already adding value, whether or not I'm the person telling the VP how to run their business. But even those little things like that, like the amount of deliverables that you get done in, X number of weeks is probably a lot more than they would have been able to do on their own in X number of months. So sometimes that might be the case. It's a resource constraint that they have on their end. Sometimes it's an expertise constraint, as you said. And yeah, typically senior consultants, partners, principals, they have all that expertise. And granted, yes, even on the consultant side, it can be pretty inefficient how we kind of take all those pieces from across the firm or from our partners and kind of deliver them to the client. But it definitely exists. They have that expertise. It makes its way into whatever decks we're presenting, whatever models we build. So I do definitely think you see value in that sense, because I think, not to sound too marketing spiely, but you do bring like an outside-in perspective, and you do things a little quicker than they might have done without your help.
Got it. I actually have this analogy that I use for consulting, and I wanted to ask if this like makes sense.
Okay.
But basically, imagine you're in like a relationship, like you're dating someone, and then you guys know your relationship the best, which is in this analogy like the company.
Okay.
But then those individuals will still ask friends, like outsiders, to give their perspective on their relationship or what they should do during like a conflict. So that's kind of how I view consulting. Maybe I don't know if this makes sense, but it's like you still ask other people for their kind of third party perspective, and that's like can be like pretty valuable. Does that make sense?
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I see that. But I think, the third party person works a lot harder to give that advice
As a consultant.
as the consultant within that relationship.
Well,
But I
your
think
best
that's
friend
fair
might just
enough.
kind of say whatever.
Just say like enough.
Yeah.
Enough
Okay.
complaining.
So then what do you feel like makes for a really like top performing consultant?
I think for most top performing consultants, because I think with a lot of people you come in, especially if you come in as an analyst, you don't really have that much expertise besides that you're, willing to work hard, and you're, averagely you're pretty smart, you're able to do, simple tasks. But I think the kind of three most important things, because consultants love threes, is what you have to be, I think, a very personable person, or just making conversation with people of all ages, feeling comfortable being sometimes maybe the youngest person in the room or the only woman in the room. And you just need to find a way to kind of insert yourself into the conversation without being, impolite or disrespectful or anything like that. I think the second is, honestly, I think organization is just a really big one. If you're like a really hyper organized person, typically for a lot of projects, there's always loads of things happening all at once. One email can change everything you need to, one email can give you 50 other tasks, and then you have to remember to go back to your other tasks later. So I think being really hyper organized will make you a very successful consultant. And I think the third is, I think it's kind of similar to the personal bit, but you have to be really willing to sometimes just like take the L, I think, for one of a better term. I think being in a client-facing role, there are a lot of times where you kind of have to just end up doing something that you don't think is the best idea, or takes extra time, like even if it's a later night, and sometimes you're just at the whim of your client. And at times it makes sense to push back, at times it doesn't. And I think so sometimes you just need to just accept the role that you're in, and do what you can for your client to make them happy, because that's the con of a client-facing role sometimes, but it can work out well.
Got it. So consulting is known for having consultants work in a variety of different projects. And so you could work on like a healthcare client for like 3 to 6 months, or maybe even a month. And then you could work in like the metals and mining industry. Like it's very, very industry broad. I don't know if that's the term. And so there's a lot of things that you can learn in the different types of industries, and then also the actual type of project you work on, whether it's like profit related or market expansion, etc. Right? There's just so much exposure that you get as a consultant. And so I was kind of curious to know, what are some of the most valuable skills that you feel you gained from all of this exposure and all your experience at Kearny?
So I think the one thing that I would say to the first part of your question, or more the statement part, is I think obviously it depends on the firm that you're at, but you can really make it as broad or as narrow as you want. If you come in thinking that you want to do only CPG work and work in consumer goods, you can. And for the most part, that's kind of the work I ended up working at most within that industry, but the projects that I did within them were very different topically. So that's kind of where I had more of the breadth, but not industry wise. And so I think people don't always realize that you can tailor it if you want to almost. I think the skills that I gained from those kind of moving around, I think it's always very good to learn how to deal with new people each time on the client side particularly, because they always have different working styles. You know, some people want to be mean and not send you data if they don't like you. I think you really learn how to organize yourself around other people's kind of working styles and requirements and things like that. I think the second is that you also realize that there are a lot more commonalities in a lot of different companies and industries that you would think. Sometimes not always for the better. I mean, bureaucracies exist in most big corporate companies, but you can sometimes really develop really great relationships with people. And I think the last and the biggest skills that you gain, I think consulting also is just a wonderful first job. I think you work hard, but I think you learn a ton in your first few years. I think it's honestly just how to be kind of very flexible and how to deal with ambiguity. I think a lot of the time you don't really know, if the next phase of work is going to sell, or if someone's going to like your deck or hate it, or the model is what they need or not what they need. And you don't always know what's coming next or what your work will be tomorrow. So I think it's very good practice to learn how to deal with ambiguity day to day, because it's something that happens a lot in life. I know it's not something that I was really prepared for, but maintaining a positive attitude while all tons of stuff is being thrown at you and you don't know what's coming next, I actually think is a really great skill for life that you get in consulting.
Yeah, so a lot coming at you and you're able to manage everything, stay organized, as you mentioned. What do you feel like actually kept you going and motivated at your job?
I think one, on projects where I was working with good people on my team, that made a huge difference in wanting to make sure I was doing a good job. And I think in consulting, they really set you up well, that it's one of those industries where obviously you don't talk about it every day, but you can talk more about what you would want to do next after consulting, when you would want to leave, going to MBA. And so I think what kept me going was when I was working with good people. When I wasn't working with good people, it was more of a day-to-day grind. But I think just knowing that there's a light at the end of the tunnel where you're going to have a lot of great opportunities to go to from there if you were to choose to leave, that you had great fallback options almost. I think that's what kept me going, especially when it was tougher working hours.
Got it. Okay, now switching gears a little bit, let's talk about some tips to get into recruiting, because I'm sure a lot of the people watching are kind of interested in that. And so you mentioned a little bit earlier to me, kind of like off camera, that you were part of the hiring process for consultants here and there. And so what do you feel like are what hiring managers look for most in future consultants?
I think always have your GPA on your resume. It never works out well if you don't, when you're applying for consulting. Unfortunately, the bad news is that sometimes you never know who's going to be looking at your resume. So it kind of depends on the person, what they're familiar with, what they recognize, what jumps out to them. But essentially, people with so many applicants, it's very difficult for people to spend a lot of time with your resume. So what's really important is to make sure kind of those key things really stand out. Like if you worked at a big company, people love to see names that they recognize. Or if you worked at a smaller company that people might not know, make sure you give a very crisp kind of intro into what it is, like a couple sentences next to it, because those kind of only few words are what stand out to people. And I think especially as an undergraduate, kind of academic rigor is important in some sense, not necessarily saying you need to triple major, definitely not. But if you were doing philosophy, like did you write a thesis? Did you spend a lot of time doing something else? And then obviously kind of those leadership things that you can show in any way, shape, or form really stand out, I think, typically when people search for resumes. So I think that makes a big difference. And I think also networking can also make a big difference, especially to kind of get you through the door with a hiring manager. If they come to recruit on campus, make sure you go to coffee chats. It can be awkward to reach out to people on LinkedIn. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But when it does work, it can really help to get you through kind of the next step and, put a check mark by your name that they were a recommended person. So I think those are kind of the two biggest things that I would say.
Cool. Awesome. And as a kind of related to this kind of initial question, what do you feel like are some of are there any other kind of consulting recruiting tips that you have that you think maybe fly under the radar or people don't really know without the former experience of working at a firm?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the best thing you can do is practice casing with literally everyone. I think what I did when I was consulting, and it was quite a thing to do at Penn undergraduate, was kind of all the people who are going into consulting would pair up and case each other, and that is invaluable practice. And so then you can even reach out to people at firms and ask someone that you know or a mutual friend if they can case you as well for practice. It makes a huge difference. And then you've already had all these practice cases, so you case someone, they case you back. Great kind of transaction that works out for everyone. I think the other thing that if you can get your hands on, I didn't love Case in Point. I know people do. I found Case in Point more helpful to read the kind of the intro sections, and then the cases in the back a little unrealistic. I think the best thing that you can do, and these are typically flying around all over the place, but business schools like Darden, Wharton, like all the business schools really, they have case books of past cases that they spend a lot of time, like consulting clubs at these schools, spend a lot of time pulling cases from various companies. And I think if you use those to do kind of the one-on-one casing that I talked about, I think that makes you way better prepared for interviews. And then I would also say that don't discount the importance of fit interviews. I think you can tell a lot about the firm by how much importance they place on the fit interview. And so I think how much you click with the person that's interviewing you can matter just as much as how well you do in your case, because it is really important to most firms that that they like you.
Awesome. So thanks for those tips about consulting recruiting. And now we're going to transition a little bit more to the MBA part. So what made you want to get an MBA, and why were you interested in the Lauder program specifically?
I think on why I wanted to get an MBA, I think two reasons. First, I'm kind of at the stage in consulting where, most people apply for business school, most people go for business school. It's kind of the next step in your consulting career. Not to say that you have to take that step, you can still continue on, but it's really kind of the stage, once you get to this stage, people tend to go to get an MBA. And typically consulting firms can be very kind about sponsorship and making sure you're all set up to go and have the right networks in place to make sure you get into a good school. So it kind of seemed like an opportunity that I didn't want to pass up. Secondly, I think it's also, while I've been generally happy with how much I've been learning in consulting, I think it was a time that I think for 2 years to get to meet new people, explore what other career paths are there, maybe to explore in X many years' time, whether it be at the end of the 2 years or not. And that also just seemed like a great opportunity that I didn't want to miss. Why Lauder specifically? I think it just, honestly, there really is no degree like it, or dual degree program like it. Penn in particular actually always has amazing dual degrees. And for the Lauder program, there's an undergraduate kind of baby version that came out of Lauder called the Huntsman program. And when I was at Penn, I wasn't in the program, but it just always seemed like a very cool, well-balanced, fascinating program that went along with my interests. And so I think with Lauder, kind of a no-brainer. I mean, I've learned Chinese for most of my life and I'm not very good at it, and it just would be such a shame to continue to let it go to waste. So to have that built into the curriculum, that I needed to, be super proficient / fluent in Chinese to graduate, was a great push. I think it also brings a bit more academic rigor to your usual MBA classes, just to have a little more, kind of a more interdisciplinary education. And one of my majors in undergrad was history, and this seemed like a very smooth transition into that. And plus, and for an extra degree for, not that significantly more work, I think seemed like a pretty good deal. So would recommend. Got it.
Actually, I realized I should have explained a little bit about what the Lauder program is. If you watch my previous videos, then you probably have some kind of idea. But it's a dual degree program at Penn where you get an MBA and a master's in international studies, and you kind of learn about international law, politics, economics, and you also, as Mei said, have to be proficient in a language to even get into the program, and you have to get better. I actually think the language class is going to be like my hardest class because I'm like really bad at Korean. But anyway, that's the program. And next I wanted to ask, it's actually only been around 3 weeks or so since our program has started. What are your first impressions from the program so far?
I think it's been great the first few weeks. I think it's been nice to meet Ben and our other friends. I think it's wonderful because we kind of have an extra So I think the only thing that Ben didn't say about our program is that it's a 2-year program, but the only difference is just an extra semester that we have a summer term before the rest of our Wharton classmates join us in the fall. So during the summer term, it's just kind of the 75 so of us on campus, getting to know each other. Granted, we're trying to juggle a lot of work with getting to know each other at the same time, and a lot of homework, which I think is kind of a little too back to school for a lot of us. But so it's been really great to get to know people. And I think you have 75 something people, then you have your area focus within that. So there's just lots of little groups within even a smaller group of 70 within the huge 900 something group of Wharton that I think you can already tell very soon that it's going to be a pretty important community for all of us for the next 2 years, just because they're people that you can probably always go back to. We've had kind of months together before everyone else. We're going to travel together, in the next couple weeks. So I think that already has given me a really positive impression of all the people that I've met.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the community at Lauder is pretty much the main kind of highlight for me too. Kind of on a similar wavelength. If you had to pick like one key kind of lesson or moment from your experience so far, it could be in classes or conversations you've had. Is there anything that kind of stands out to you?
Well, so obviously we've only been here a couple weeks, but I think a moment that was pretty cool was one of the Lauder senior global fellows. His name is Mohammed Al-Arian, and he's a very, very accomplished academic, economist. He used to work in the corporate life, so CEO. So he's a very accomplished guy who's now at Cambridge. But I think he had a kind of a Zoom talk with us. But I think one of the things that you really take from him is people are asking him super complicated economics questions, kind of political questions, state of the world affairs questions. And I think what you really realize when you speak to him is that the smartest people say things in the simplest terms. I think even in consulting, which I guess is another lesson in consulting, is how verbose people tend to be and how much you just want to like cram words into a page. And one partner that I used to work with a lot used to say, "Oh, I didn't have time to make 5 slides, so I made 50."
Oh, yeah,
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's a similar kind of lesson from Mohammed Al-Arian. Is just everything he says, he puts it very concisely, very simply. Even the most complicated issues, he really cuts to the core of it in a very understandable, straightforward way. And so I think it just doubled down on the lesson for me that the smartest people really are the ones who are, speaking in the simplest terms.
Yeah, I actually remember that too, and I feel like that was one of also my like aha kind of lessons that I had throughout like the past few weeks. I guess like trying to put that to the test a little bit. Let's kind of talk about MBA application tips. And the MBA application process is kind of like complex. There's a lot of different kind of parts that you have to do well in order to kind of get admittance. Do you have like a few simple tips for anyone interested in applying for an MBA?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think the first one so obviously the big thing to get out of the way when you're applying for MBA is taking the GMAT or the GRE. I took the GMAT, and I think some of the advice that I started to give people after I took the GMAT and went through that whole experience is really about, kind of knowing your strengths. Me, for example, I'm less good at the math portion of things, and I was a lot stronger on the verbal. And I think for the people who take the GMAT in general, who you're curved against, most of the people who take the GMAT are significantly better at math. So you can crawl your way up the percentile, crawl your way up the curve if you're adequately good at math and really good at verbal. So if you're good at both, because it's difficult for the people who take the test to be good at both. They're typically really good at math and significantly less good at verbal. So the advice that I tend to give people after is if that's your strength, work really hard on your verbal to get it as high up in the percentile as possible. And if your math is just above averagely good, doesn't have to be amazing, doesn't have to be even 80th, 90th, 80th percentile, even 70th percentile, you can still be in the 99th percentile overall if you did really well in your verbal. So I think it's more about knowing your strengths. If you're always going to be horrible at math, just get it to an adequate, pretty good level, 60th, 70th percentile level, and then really make sure your verbal shines. Because I think that's another way you can get a really great score without killing yourself. I think the other two things that I would say, first, especially if you're looking to apply to kind of all the M7 big schools, the essays that I would tackle first are your Harvard and your Stanford ones. Those are the most open, the most kind of vague questions that you don't really know what they're looking for. It can take a lot of time to think how you want to form your essay. And actually, don't spend too much time thinking. At some point, it's just great to get stuff on a page.
Yeah.
But once you kind of have those two, if you are applying to those two, once you have one of those two kind of well-formed, you feel pretty good about where you're going with it, it'll help you craft your narrative and your story for the rest of your applications. And I think then it's a little easier to start to kind of not plug and play, but take the bits of that resonated the most and use them for other schools' applications, because those typically have questions that are a little more clear-cut and straightforward, and you know how to answer them, or at least you know how to start answering them. So that would be my advice on the essay part.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for the practical tips. And I'm sure a lot of the people watching hopefully found that really helpful. And kind of like rounding out our kind of MBA section of the interview, what are your kind of post-MBA goals or long-term career goals?
Well, I think right post MBA, I think I'm obviously thinking very hard about going back to consulting. I love the firm that I was at. Kearney is a awesome firm, great firm to have been at for the last 4 years. But I think that's kind of the point of the next 2 years for me, and it's different for a lot of people. For me, I think it's going to be a great opportunity to explore a little, hopefully do an internship or two in areas that I find interesting, learn from my new peers what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy, what they feel would be, what was a good fit for them, what wasn't, and why it was. So I guess the short answer is I'm not entirely sure, but I'm hoping that part of my MBA experience, which I think is common for some people, is to try and figure it out.
Yeah, and that's honestly really kind of refreshing in a sense to hear, because I think a lot of people feel like they have to go into MBA programs knowing exactly what they want to do. And it's actually great if you do, but then it can also be like a great time to kind of explore. So yeah, now that we've kind of talked about MBA stuff, let's kind of move on to a few just kind of more personal, fun-ish related questions. Actually, the first question is not necessarily fun, but I think it's a little bit more, shares more insight into what you think about things outside of kind of like career-only stuff. But first one is, if you could kind of go back in time and give your former self in college some advice, like what kind of advice would you give her? Yeah.
I think the advice I would give myself is one, be more secure in myself and where I was going. I think you don't always have to know exactly every single step or have a 5-10 year plan. Things work out almost always. And I think just giving yourself a little bit of breathing room to not have gotten it exactly right kind of freshman year, even sophomore year, didn't get a great internship sophomore year. I think giving yourself that space to breathe makes all the difference in the world. Second, I would say maybe have studied computer science because it seems like a really nice life right now.
I kind of think that too, actually.
Yeah, maybe study computer science, although I did love history. And I did like econ. Well, less, but I loved history. And I think the last thing that I would say is what I would say back to my former self is that I think that there's just, people forget sometimes that there's plenty of opportunities for everybody. I mean, maybe it's not the exact job at the exact company you've always wanted or dreamed of, but there's enough opportunities for everyone. So I think it never doesn't make sense to help your friend or a peer or someone that you know, because I just think there's room for everyone to be successful in this life. And the more you help others, you never know what you're going to get back in return. And I feel a lot of the time that people have helped me to, get a great project at work, or even come to know what classes to take when I'm at Wharton. I think it never comes at a cost to you to give someone all the help you can in class or at work or anything like that.
The moral of the story is to help your friends, maybe even strangers. It actually ties well to the last question. Hopefully you guys all got to understand who Mei is a little bit more from this interview. And I wanted to end a bit more on a personal note in a sense, so you can get to know her even better, which is like, what are 2 or 3 personal values that you find really important? And this doesn't need to be professional at all. It can be personal. What are some things that are really important to you?
I think, some of which I've already talked about a little. I think the first is that I really do believe that there's room for everybody to be successful in their own way. Everyone wants to do slightly different things. Everyone's a little different. And so I think really having that camaraderie across age groups, work groups, schools, colleagues. I think it would be better just for everybody. The second, I think, is just not compromising your values in any work situation. I think especially sometimes when you're working in a client-facing situation, you may not want to stand up for yourself or say something that felt off or a weird comment, but you definitely should. I think everyone deserves to be respected and supported in their own way. And the third thing I would say is just in your work life, in your professional life, but especially in your work life, I think just never forget genuine human or basic human kindness and decency. I think this sounds almost like a no-brainer, but it can be pretty hard to remember, when it's a stressful late night or you're working horrible hours and it's a crazy corporate job, but just asking your client how their day's been going or about their family or about your coworkers' families and how life is in general, I think it can make all the difference in the world, because I think with the first thing I said, when you help others and they help you back, it's kind of a similar thing. So just remembering that everyone you're working with is also a human being and a person, I think can make you very successful in your career, because I think social navigation is also a very important skill. So that's a value that I would never compromise, just remembering that everyone around me is also their own person.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to actually end the interview. I learned a ton myself, and I think the key takeaway is that consultants really love the number 3. With that said, thank you, Mei, for all your time and sharing all of your insights to everyone. And yeah, with that said, hope you all enjoyed the interview and catch you all in the next video. Thanks so much. Wave, Mei.